Hello, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm excited to welcome you all here today to another in the series of customer webinars that we've been conducting, and this is part of our best practices series that we're running. And today's topic, I think, is one that probably has a lot of attention, both because of the topic and because of a special guest that we have on today. So today we're going to be talking about detecting and blocking cyber threats and how you can maximize your Netwrix investment to accomplish some of those goals. So I want to thank you all for carving out time to be with us today and for being customers. And we'll move ahead. I think one slide, Michael. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping here. So we are going to be recording, and we will send you the content. You will not see any slides during the presentation. We're probably going to add some at the end and send them to you, but don't worry if you don't see anything changing on the screen when we're not demonstrating the product. We try to keep these very workshop-like and not PowerPoint you to death, so don't worry about not seeing any slides. We'll use the Q&A function to submit questions, and we're going to do all the questions today at the end. It's a little bit of departure on how we sometimes do it, but we're going to keep them at the end because we have a lot of good content that we want to make sure we get through, and we're going to try to get you in and out here in 60 minutes. So that's a bit of housekeeping. Everyone's on mute. Today, as I mentioned, is the detecting and blocking cyber threats. You can see in May, we'll be talking about compliance, how you validate internal controls, improve regulatory compliance. And then in June, we're going to be looking at some third-party integration capabilities and how you can further bake Netwrix into your tech stack. So I'm excited about those topics as well. Before I introduce the team that you see up on the screen here, we're going to ask you for a little bit of help. We have two poll questions today. We'll do one now, we'll do one at the end. They're a little bit detached from the topic per se, but the first one you can see here up on the screen. Are you concerned about SaaS PaaS data security on the following platforms? And if you could just go in and select any of those that you do have some concerns about the data security within, that'd be very helpful to us. And we'll share out the results of the poll when we share out the content and send that out to everybody in a follow-up. We probably won't put the results up now, but we'll give everyone a few seconds to populate that. And while you're doing that, and thank you for doing that, I'm joined today by Michael Purden, who, if you've been an attendee on these sessions in the past, you have probably seen. He is famous for his excellent content and for his many World Wrestling Federation belts that you see behind him when he's on camera. And then I mentioned a special guest, and you can see him up there on the screen. Gavin Ashton is joining us. He is a very well-known security strategist and a member of our Netwrix family now through our coming together with Stealth Bits, and I'm very excited to have him here. He brings a level of security expertise to this session and to the company that I think is something that everyone can benefit from. I know I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say, and I'm sure all of you will as well, and will benefit from it. So without any further ado, I'm gonna fade into the background and leave you with Gavin, and then Gavin will be working with Michael on some demonstrations as well. So Gavin, thank you, and take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, everybody. Gavin Ashton. I'm feeling very validated today. I tend to frame my things around stories, and earlier on I saw a post about how humans take away a lot more information when you present things in a story, and that was sort of, the statistics and things to go with it. So hopefully you walk away with this feeling like you've gained something worthwhile. So let me dive right in. We're gonna have a few demos sort of sprinkled throughout this, but there's gonna be a lot of talking, so apologies for that. But hopefully I've laid it out in a consumable way, so we'll see. So way back in my father's day, he used to carry around a briefcase, right? Everything was done on paper. And in the boot of his car, he had this overhead projector that he used to sort of carry around with him, and so he could present wherever he went. And the risk was in the physical media that he carried about with him. So, he could get it lost, he could get it stolen, copied maybe. Perhaps if he was that way inclined, maybe he'd sort of sell it on to competitors or what have you. But the internet didn't even exist for most of his working life. And then I remember in the late 80s or early 90s, he got what he called a laptop. And it was this massive heavy thing. It was bicolor screen, it was slow, it was noisy, it had no connectivity. And he used to run Lotus Notes on that thing. So I don't know if you ever used Lotus Notes, but basically you had a local cut of a database, and you had to go back to base to sync up. But again, connectivity was almost non-existent. So most of the threats in that case were again based around the physical access to his endpoint there. You know, and then the back end somewhere in London, they had a database that was stored there. Now, when I started my professional career, we had sort of Windows NT networks and then Active Directory in the year sort of 99/2000. And the internet was something we had, but it still wasn't sort of on the mobile device as we think of it today. It was something that was accessed through a browser or email. And really at a business level, we kind of kept it at arm's length, right? Everything was still structured around the data center and the office block, buildings that we manage. You know, that's what I call these four walls. So you perhaps have an internet connection, but we really had minimal exposure. It was something that we firewalled and proxied, and speed was rubbish anyway, so it was really of limited value. Now, some organizations back then would have been managing access within the four walls using what we still call the principle of least privilege, but probably more from the perspective of managing insider threats, so people inside our four walls. All right, we don't want the database folks managing servers, that kind of stuff. You know, maybe we're concerned about folks connecting physical key loggers onto desktop systems, right? But in terms of outside the four walls, well, we had more laptops at this point. You know, they were getting a little faster and a little bit lighter, but they've still been managed like on-premises devices, right? So we'd have builds, patching, connectivity, probably over a VPN, you know, to get them back into our four walls. We still manage them like an internal device. All right, no iPhones, no apps, no cloud storage, and no SaaS as we sort of recognize it today. And then fast forward to the present time, you know, we've got these mobile devices now, we've got mobility, dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of internet-based services. Right, our connectivity has increased exponentially in ways that, well, they boggle my mind at least. So, you know, some of us, including myself, probably spend a lot of time thinking about privacy and where our data sits. But if we're honest, you know, about that, you know, we think about over the years, how many places on the internet have we shared things like, you know, our date of birth, where we were born, our mother's maiden name? You know, think about all the ways in which that data has been stored and processed and shared and sold and compromised, right? And then all that data is tucked away somewhere in corners of the internet that we can't really comprehend at this point. So my level of confidence in true privacy is pretty low. But you know, just while preparing for this webinar, the hackernews.com broke a story of 120 compromised ad servers being used to spread sort of millions of users into fake security and VPN apps. So it's under constant attack. Now, the relevance of all of this to threats is this, right? Our information, both business and personal, has value. And the surface area to which that information is exposed has increased dramatically over the past few decades, right? We store and process our data on a diverse set of devices across a diverse set of systems. Now, there's people out there who are targeting the data. You know, we know that, we see that every day in the news, right? Or compromising the systems which provide access to that data. And it's not just an increase in surface area which increases that risk, right? The sophistication of the tools and techniques used by bad actors has been developing just as quickly, right? And not only that, but the ubiquity and availability of those tools and techniques has also been expanding, right? So according to a recent report from Group IB, ransomware as a service accounted for 64% of the attacks that they studied, right? And half of those, 50%, were carried out by just 3 APTs, advanced persistent threat groups. So the pandemic, and you know, we see this in the news as well, has fueled an increase in ransomware, you know, not just a lot, but 150% a lot, right? So dramatically. So we've really got to be on our guard more than ever before. Right, so maybe they're trying to steal some of the sensitive stuff and then extort us with the threat of releasing that publicly or selling it. Maybe they're trying to compromise the integrity of that data, right, by changing it, perhaps, you know, to have payments redirected or somehow impact your business operations. Maybe they just want to bring your systems down completely and hold you to ransom. So thanks, Mike, for the nice sort of introduction. Part of that reason was I was at ground zero in 2017 when the company I worked for was taken down by a state-sponsored attack, right? Except we weren't even the target, right? The interconnected nature of the world that we live in now means that we don't even have to be that target anymore. In my case, we were simply collateral damage, or in our case, more appropriately. Right, the attack encrypted every single domain joined system around the globe. Okay, so there's workstations and laptops, servers, databases, application servers, Active Directory, domain controllers, the lot, right? And back in those days, an event like that was pretty big news. But fast forward to today, it's only 4 short years. These kinds of stories are happening every single week, sometimes multiple times a week, right? I mentioned those numbers earlier on from Group IB. We got to a point now where we're desensitized to this news, but the impact upon organizations is dramatic. So we really need to be on the lookout for signs of compromise, and Active Directory is a fantastic place to start. Active Directory is that glue that binds together all of our assets that have a relationship back to the directory. So users, computers, servers, apps, databases. When systems are domain joined, we're reliant upon the integrity of that directory to ensure our data remains safe. Now, the recent Solorigate story is one where AD was actually used as a pathway to assets stored in the cloud. Okay, where organizations are still using ADFS to authenticate to cloud assets, authentication is still fundamentally taking place on premises in Active Directory. So the reach of Active Directory can actually go beyond the limits of that domain boundary. So in terms of managing AD then, now AD is a pretty complicated technology, and I'm going to make some assumptions that everyone here sort of understands those concepts of forests, domains, domain controllers, replication, and how those sort of interlink. What I'm not going to make any assumptions about is our understanding of how precisely to manage Active Directory, okay, or how to deploy and manage that principle of least privilege, things like that. So the way I think about principle of least privilege is vertical and horizontal, okay? So vertical takes us through the sort of tiered access model, the Bell-LaPadula model, where we've got sort of workstations at the bottom, then servers, and then domain controllers at the top. Horizontal takes us across those assets. So maybe we're a global organization, let's say, and we've got regional sites. So splitting the workstations across that vertical picture horizontally would allow us to define pockets of privilege. So maybe UK workstations, US workstations, Southeast Asia workstations. Or the other way would be to split by the teams to look after them. So maybe sort of team X workstations, team Y workstations. With servers, splitting those horizontally might go to sort of where those systems are hosted, or what systems they run, databases, apps, so on, or even what applications they underpin. But basically, we're trying to constrain access to as tight a scope as possible, given the role that an individual has, okay? So by and large, we achieve that through admin controls, admin accounts, groups, and then the controls in places like group policy. So for example, within SQL Server, you can configure AD groups to have some level of access of control over that SQL instance. Why that matters for threats is that an attacker is after our data, and the more broad access, right, people have both vertically and horizontally, and particularly when that access is permanent, the easier we're making it for the bad actors. Now, the controls we manage to deploy the principle of least privilege can be misconfigured, okay, or perhaps there isn't particular attention to paid to some of these areas, which means that over time they fall into neglect. That's not to say we are negligent, but in reality, there's limited resources, priorities are placed in other areas, and these are just things which aren't consistently applied across all organizations. If they were, we wouldn't see so much in the news. So let's have a look at some of these. Okay, so all of the threats I'm about to talk through are ones that we can monitor through Netwrix Auditor, and we'll demo some of these as well. So the first one here, we'll have a demo at the end of this just to sort of split up the talking bit, is admin SD holder. So hopefully everybody's familiar with the domain admins group, and this is a group which gives us gold mode access to all assets in Active Directory. We can add ourselves to enterprise admins, which provides that level of access across the whole forest, and then schema admins, which allows us to manage the sort of database schema of the directory itself. But domain admins allows us to do pretty much whatever we like within that domain boundary. Okay, we can sign into domain controllers, we can create, edit, delete any object within the directory. So given that level of privilege and control, once your domain admins group is compromised, you've basically lost trust in your directory and possibly more. Okay, so something of a consistent miss that we see out in the field is this practice of including domain admins in the local admins group on all member systems. Okay, the reason for that is simple. It's a default configuration on domain joined Windows servers and clients. So in the days before the internet really became prevalent, I guess it didn't really stand out. Okay, But today, you really want to make sure that we're removing those sensitive built-in groups like domain admins via your restricted groups GPO from member systems, for example. The only place a domain admin credential should be used is on a domain controller or some other component of our identity infrastructure. So the reason that's important is that today it's like the domain admins has got a huge level of direct privilege, not just over your directory, but your systems and your data too. So, but even with that said, if you've removed all that default configuration with domain admin privileges, a bad actor can still reverse engineer all that back in and can create access paths for whatever account they want. So we really care about the membership of domain admins, as well as a number of other sort of sensitive groups. And this is where admin SD holder comes in. So typically in AD, we apply permissions to containers and organizational units or OUs, and then rely on inheritance to flow those security settings down to child objects. And there are things like deny inheritance settings, which complicate the picture a little bit when you understand the concept of applying a security setting. But let's say, allow team X workstation admins to have, create and delete permissions to computer objects in their OU, and allowing that to filter down to child computer objects. We get that principle. Sensitive groups like domain admins are a little bit different. So these are things like domain admins, administrators, schema admins, that kind of thing. With these, there's a process called SD-prop. What SD-prop does is periodically looks at the security applied to an object called admin SD holder, and then applies those settings to any objects marked as sensitive, regardless of where they sit within the directory. So imagine we've got someone in the system, and they've managed to somehow add an account that they've owned to the domain admins group. Now, it might be the case that someone reviews that membership shortly afterwards and then proactively removes that membership. Perfect. But what happens the next time the SD-prop runs? So imagine if they use that privilege to modify the admin SD holder object to provide the user account that they've compromised to the list of accounts that have modified permissions over the admin SD holder object. Okay, SD-prop runs, those updated permissions are copied from the admin SD holder object back over to domain admins group, and then all the other sensitive groups as well. And then the bad actor can use their compromised account to add themselves right back into the domain admins group. And that's a classic persistence maneuver. Okay, so admin SD holder is used to stamp permissions on objects marked as sensitive. So that's why we care about that object. Okay, typically you wouldn't expect change to that object outside some sort of change control process that's got a relatively high degree of visibility given the sensitivity of that object. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Michael for a quick demo.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm going to go ahead and share out my Netwrix server. So as far as what Gavin was mentioning, it's probably wise to set up an alert to find out if the permissions have been changed on the admin SD holder. There's nothing, as long as you have an Active Directory plan in place, there's nothing you need to do extra to get Netwrix to give you this data except to create the alert. So if you aren't very familiar with how to create alerts, I would recommend viewing some webinars that we did a couple of months ago. One of them was specifically on alerts, and it went into alert creation and some of the advanced functionality of the alert. So I won't cover that too much here. I'm just going to go ahead and go through a typical alert creation. And I'm going to start with my search. So if you've ever been on any of the other webinars I've done, if I've covered search, you'll know that a tip that I always give is start every search with data source. If you have any type of issues with slowness from searches, try adding data source to your first one. Even if you have monitoring plan in your search, add data source in front of it and you'll drastically speed up your search results. So I'm going to do data source Active Directory. And I'm going to do what I'm going to do ends with. That way I don't have to get the full path to the admin SD holder. And if I'm wanting to know if permissions have been changed, I'm then going to add a third line that's details, starts with object security. And you'll see the results. You'll see that the admin SD holder was recently changed. And this account was given permissions. Actually, this account had permissions removed on it. And then here it had the permissions added to it. So if you wanted to get an alert anytime that admin SD holder had a permission change to it, you would take this search. You would then go up to your tools and you could do create alert. From here, we just need to name it. Come over here to our recipients, and as far as who's going to get that alert, your filters are going to populate from your search, so you shouldn't have to do much here. And then your thresholds for this type of alert, you're not going to want to put a threshold on. You're going to want to know if it changes, period. So you want to leave the threshold off. And then your risk score, which flows into behavioral anomalies, which we've also done a webinar on that, so you can go back and look that up to see what this does. But this is a pretty severe issue that or item that could happen, so I'm going to give that a risk score of 90, and then I'm going to add that. And if you wanted to view it, you could then go into your alerts, and you would see right here you've got the alert that happened. So now, if there was another change to admin SD holder where the permissions changed, I would get an email as soon as we picked that up. All right, so Gavin, I'll go ahead then and turn it back over to you for the next threat.
Nice one. Cheers, Michael. So the next thing we want to think about pretty carefully is group managed service account permissions. So service accounts, right? Always been a bit of a nightmare. We create these when services need some sort of user principal to do stuff, right? Okay, whether that's sort of run a service or go and do a thing and on some other resources, what have you. But the problems always arise when a vendor says something like, add the account to domain admins or enable unconstrained delegation, okay, which means we're then more often than not providing some sort of, very excessive privileges onto the service accounts, or we create them, but we fail to note which app they belong to or who requested them or what position in the organization owns them, okay, which makes accountability nigh on impossible. And their passwords are often set to never expire as well. So you end up with all this sort of standing privilege lying around, possibly with weak credentials and no easy way of dealing with it, with the lack of accountability. And that's where group managed service accounts or GMSAs come in. Okay, so these are basically tied to computer objects. Okay, so it's really easy to determine what they're used for. Okay, AD takes over password management, just a better solution all around. The problem with GMSAs come in with how administrators can sometimes interact with them. So the whole point of them is that there's something that we sort of set up and then leave. They do their job, you don't have to worry about them. But people tinker, right? And sometimes you find groups or individuals that have been given permissions to specific group managed service accounts, for example, to read their password blobs, right? So why is that a problem? So similar to the previous threat, this is the method that attackers can leverage to gain access to sensitive systems, okay? They get access to those password blobs. You can imagine what happens from there, okay? Perhaps this is the means to gain access to the data that they want to get access to directly, or possibly as a means to use those systems to then traverse laterally through the environment to get into other systems or data. So the best way of keeping on top of those is to keep an eye out for permission changes to GMSA objects, okay? And over one attribute in particular, which is principals allowed to retrieve managed password. Okay, so we can use the auditing features in Netwrix Auditor to set up alerts on changes to permissions to group managed service objects. Another sort of threat that we want to think about is hidden objects. So I spent a little bit of time thinking about how we layer security in Active Directory. So when we think about permissions, we often think of it in terms of enabling permissions, okay? So by default, all users in AD can read all objects. So then permission becomes something that we ought to enable users or computers or groups to do things like create, delete, modify objects. But on the flip side, it's also possible to deny permissions. Now, if you're routinely using deny permissions, then possibly the OU layup isn't optimal. But when it comes to the hidden object threat, this is what it means. So if an attacker were to create an OU buried away somewhere out of the way in your directory, and then deny everyone list child permissions on that OU, they've basically set up a little base of operations. Okay, so they can create whatever they like in that OU, and not even the most privileged users will be able to see that content. So given how most organizations have got sort of deeply nested group hierarchies, that provide access to sensitive assets, those users can then be given access to those assets potentially without alarm bells ringing, or perhaps the user could be added to the admin SD holder account permissions. We know where that leads. So staying on the lookout for hidden objects is really worthwhile. Organizations shouldn't generally use deny permissions anyway, but perhaps where we see deny read permissions being set, that should raise an alarm. So that's something else we can look out for in terms of those permissions being assigned. High risk permissions, so on file shares. So here be dragons. You've got issues with ownership, file permissions, share permissions, inheritance blocking. All these things which could have been around for a couple of decades at this point. Throwing different styles of managing these things, potential mismanagement, proliferation of rights, which give access to people to do more than perhaps they need, and all that's just growing complexity. And my mantra is keep it simple, stupid. That's my favorite mantra. But if there's some classic signs of overprivilege, you can be pretty sure there's something that's gone amiss. Okay, and that's where we see these high risk permissions. So things like users or authenticated users or everyone being granted full control. Just auditing for those things, it's going to give us something we can use on an operational basis. Okay, so if we get an alert or a monitor that pops up, full control given to users, that's something we can use to then go and snipe those sorts of issues. Another threat, insecure UAC changes. So we're not talking about Windows UAC here, where you get asked before you elevate into an admin context. User accounts in AD have a set of user account controls which are completely separate and distinct from the Windows control. So some of these you'll probably be aware of already. So things like account locked out. Okay, so say you've already hit that the incorrect password limits on your domain password policy, or maybe you got the account disabled. Let's say the person's left the organization, your process is to disable accounts. Okay, there's some settings in that UAC bucket which we want to keep a sharp eye out for. So things like trusted for delegation, or password never expires, or password not required, store password with reversible encryption. So these are things which we should be vetoing, okay, at least in sort of production environments, right? So we want to know with a pretty high alarm rate when we want to know when those options are selected. So the ones which relate to passwords, those are pretty self-explanatory, but the trusted for delegation one is a favorite of sort of red teams and bad actors everywhere. So an account with that flag is essentially able to impersonate any accounts in the domain. Okay, there's a few steps involved, but that's the crux of it. Where accounts have that setting, we need to treat those with extreme caution. Okay, so you want to make sure that we know exactly where they're able to sign in. Okay, so we need to add them to any blocking groups we might have set up. Okay, so like you find in the Microsoft tiered access model, if you've ever come across that, there's actual deny groups that set up, specifically where accounts can and can't log into. Okay, so we need to know who can access those systems where they can log in. Okay, who's got the credentials for those accounts, who could administer the accounts. Okay, we need to treat them like tier 0 objects, because that's a pretty high degree of trust. So you get the idea for that. So for those UAC controls that we need to keep our eyes out for, those are things we can set up monitoring for, and probably alerts for, given the danger there. Next is replication permissions. So we've got a concept of AD, okay, and how information is stored on domain controllers and how those replicate information around the forest. Okay, so you might be somewhat aware of update sequence numbers, okay, and how they're used in replication, and the role of the PDC emulator, right, when it comes to password changes. What you might not be aware of is that there's a couple of security delegations that can be made at the domain level itself. So these are replicating directory changes, and there's 3 of them that all start with replicating directory changes, basically. So they all interlink, which we don't really have time to go into today, but ultimately you need to know there's 3 of them. They all matter, and to treat them in much the same way. So what we need to do is normally those permissions are given things to things like Microsoft Identity Manager, for example, which can be involved in how you manage accounts within the directory, including their passwords. Okay, or Azure AD Connect. Okay, so if you do password write back from Azure AD, it's through Azure AD Connect that those passwords get written back into your directory. So that can be involved in those sort of cloud-based self-service password reset workflows. So things which have a legitimate role in handling objects and those sensitive attributes within the directory. Again, those are all services that we treat as sort of tier 0 or domain controller or identity infrastructure sort of security. But what we certainly don't want is for people to be adding random accounts to those privileges. So again, those are things that we should be keeping an eye out for. So if people are changing or giving credentials or accounts, replicating directory changes, permissions to your domain, that's something you can look out for with the Netwrix Auditor. We'll have a demo shortly just after this one, so thanks for bearing with me. So sensitive group changes. We've spoken about admin SD holder and how the permissions of on that object are synchronized through the SD prop process to a set of objects which we classify as sensitive. What we also want to do, similar to the replicating directory changes permission, is monitor for changes over these groups. Okay, so these should be groups that we have sort of 0 unplanned or unapproved changes over. Okay, so if people are regularly adding or removing members without any visibility or approval, then our directory is at least somewhat open to compromise. So these are groups like domain admins, administrators, schema admins, enterprise admins, all those sensitive groups. Okay, and it's fairly simple to set up alerts for seeing changes to those groups. So I think, Michael, we're going to have a quick demo on that one just now.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it's pretty simple because we already have something built in for that might just need a little bit of tweaking. So for this one, for making changes or for monitoring changes to sensitive groups, I'm actually going to start in alerts. And this is a good place to show that even though we have a lot of built-in alerts, if you wanted to narrow down to a particular source, you can go up here to filter by tags, and I'm going to pick Active Directory. And you'll see that we already have member added to privileged group, member removed from privileged group. Now, a lot of times customers want one alert, whether it's an add or a remove. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and create that. I recommend never modifying one of the built-in alerts. You can, definitely, but sometimes you might need that again. So I'm going to take the member added to privileged group, and I'm just going to create a second copy of it. I'm going to duplicate it. And then I'm going to come up here, I'm going to turn it on, and I'm just going to change this to changes to privileged groups. Now, the next part in here that I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to filters. Now, by default, your privileged groups are going to be in the users container. However, a lot of times that does get changed. So what you could do, if you happen to know where it got moved to, if it did, you could change that, or you could just take out the /users and make it just end in the actual group. Now, perhaps you want to add to this. Maybe you want to add server operators. So let's add a what ends with, right? Maybe there's some other groups that you want to monitor. You can add as many as you want to here. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and add a second details and take the added and changed it to removed. Or if you want to know about any change at all, you could also just remove that altogether. So let's just say any change at all. So we'll leave it at that. And then same thing, you go fill out your recipient. If you noticed on the first page, the risk score for the add was higher than the risk score for the remove. The risk score is whatever you want to make it. It's however, whatever level of threat you think this particular change is. So I'm going to leave it on the higher side. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on the add. And now I've got my new one in addition to the two that were in here from default. So now anytime there's a change, of course, I'll get an email when that happens. All right, Gavin, back to you.
Thanks, Michael. I just noticed actually that I've got a technical today, so I'm on my sort of laptop my laptop webcam here. So apologies, I'm sort of peering down at everybody today. So next threat that we want to think about is SID history tampering. So this is somewhat more of a challenge for attackers to abuse, but it's a valid threat vector. Okay, so if you don't know what SID history is, this is something that any organization that's attempted to migrate from one AD domain to another will have come across. So basically every object in the domain has got a unique SID. Okay, and the SID is like a barcode each object has, okay, which describes things like the domain to which the object belongs. It's basically a unique identifier. Now, when we migrate from one domain to another, we start using our user accounts in our target domain, but maybe we still want to access resources in our old domain, okay, and that's where the SID history object comes in. Essentially, the SID that we had on the user object in the source domain is copied to our new user object in the target domain in the SID history attribute. So we've got a new SID for our new user object in the new domain, but it's got this original SID that's copied across from the original domain. Now, until all and that's something we have until all the resources are migrated to the new domain. So we need to retain that SID history value, but this is a risk because what an attacker could do if they're able to compromise some user account would be to copy, say, an enterprise admin group member's SID from the original domain to their compromised user account, and then boom, they've achieved dominance over the whole over the forest. So we want to make sure that people are not making changes to SID history values outside of any expected sort of or approved processes. So you've taken part in a migration, you know what accounts should be manipulating those SID history values. We're going to be watching those like a hawk. And the last one, we'll have a demo for this one, is service creation. So we know that domain controllers are amongst the most sensitive devices in our environment, okay? We should know precisely what processes and services are running on our domain controllers. Nothing should be unexpected. We should be aware of what those systems are doing. Now, many of the tools which red teams and bad actors alike will try and run will actually create services on domain controllers. So that's a really simple thing to look out for. Now, when we see signs of service creation, so for example, sysinternals, psexec is a classic one. It might just be that we've got an administrator account or an admin doing their job, okay? In which case, fine, maybe have a word with them about running those kinds of things on domain controllers, but it might also be a sign of compromise, okay? And bad actors are setting up, persistence or performing reconnaissance, or in the process of, stealing data or encrypting data. So process creation on domain controllers is well worth our time monitoring. So at this point, back to Michael for a demo.
All right, so for this last one, for all the ones that we've been talking about before, you have to have an Active Directory monitoring plan set up. This one's going to be a little bit different. You have to have a Windows server monitoring plan or a Windows auditing plan. And then you have a couple of different ways for how you can monitor this. I'm going to go into my monitoring plans real quick and go under my Windows systems. So when you're adding a Windows auditing plan, you can add your entire domain if you want, and then have it automatically just find any domain controllers. Or you can add individual computers and add the monitoring plans. Of course, it's a lot less effort if you add the entire container and let it just find the domain controllers. That way, if one is added or removed, it'll automatically be taken care of. When it comes to doing an alert for service creation, we're going to again start with search. And this time we're going to start with data source, Windows Server. Now, since I have 3 different Windows Server plans, I'm going to then pick monitoring plan, my domain controller one. Now, if you didn't have a lot of domain controllers, you could just add where and then put the names of the controllers, but I'll pick the whole plan. Your object type, this is going to be one that some people, if you're creating this on your own, you may not have gotten any data. It's actually system service that you're going to pick for the object type. And then we're going to do action equals added. All right. Now, most of these are just automated ones that you can see here. If there are any that I wanted to exclude because I know that they're acceptable, I can come down here to my exclude from search and pick the item that I want to exclude. I could also do does not contain. That way I don't have to worry about that. And from there, I can go up to tools and do the same thing, create my alert. So I can do pick my recipients, which once you put an email address in here, it'll have a drop down. You'll see all of them. My filters come from there, and I'll give it a risk score of, let's give it a 60. And then we'll add that. So now all of the alerts that we've created today are on and showing up in here. And I believe, Gavin, did you have anything to close up before we went to questions?
No, I was done. I was going to do sort of a quick wrap up, but I mean, if
Sure.
time's running tight, we can go straight to Q&A.
I think you have time.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say, thanks for listening through that. So we've got some tips there around things we can look out for in Active Directory, particularly to the most sensitive things in the directory that we really care about, but also sort of signs of things that are sort of part of the common, what we call tools, techniques, and procedures that attackers use. So things like going for group managed service accounts, okay, or going after sort of SID history or admin SD holder. So going through those things that we've talked about today will put you in a much better stead of in terms of protecting yourself against these sorts of attacks we read about with depressing frequency now. So thank you for listening to those.
And a quick
Mike.
note, if we didn't mention it in the beginning, all of the threats that Gavin talked about can be monitored with Netwrix. So tomorrow, when you get the recording, you're going to get a copy of the slide deck. At the end of the slide deck, there will be screenshots of how to build either the search or the report to capture each of the alerts. So it won't just be the 3 that we talked about today, but all of them will be in the documentation that you get tomorrow.
That's excellent, Michael. I think that'll be very valuable. So first I want to thank Gavin and Michael for a great job presenting that content. We have one question at this point. So I want to encourage folks, if you were holding your questions for the end, now would be the time. But the question that we have is, for the admin SD holder, I get no data found with when searching with data source and what. Is this expected?
Gavin, I had some in mind when we first talked, but for most people, would they expect to not have any changes to that, depending on how long they've had Netwrix in place?
Yeah, I mean, ideally you see no changes. Okay, so that shouldn't be something that's changing. I mean, it'd be very infrequent. So if you've got nothing, that's a good thing. You could validate it by editing the permissions, but I'd be very careful. Maybe add something that you trust. So maybe if you've already got a domain admin account, for example, maybe add that member as a direct permission to that object. See the alert come through Netwrix Auditor, and then go back and remove it again. But that, that's all I'd add to that. But if you've got no results right now, that's not a bad thing necessarily.
And actually, let me show, because I did the same thing to prepare for this, and a lot of people may not know how to test that change. So let me show you. I've connected now to my domain controller instead of my Netwrix server. So if you wanted to test this, you would go under, where was admin SD holder, Gavin, again?
It's under system.
System, that's right.
Yeah.
All right, so you would pull up Active Directory users and computers. And again, you want to be extremely careful with this. As Gavin said, test it with a domain admin account that you already have. And then also do a very limited scope on what you do. So go under System, right click on Admin SD Holder. For my testing, I went under Security. Now, if you don't see this, you have to make sure you turn on Advanced Features up in the view in order to see this. And then Security. And then I added an account that, this is my lab environment, but I added an account that I knew was safe. And all I did for this, actually, it's best to do it under Advanced, that way you can get granular with it. So what I did for testing purposes, I added this account and only gave it the change password and reset password permission, and same with this account that we saw in the results. So if I wanted to test it, I could just remove those that I added. Or if you don't have anything in here, you can just add I'll pick myself. And then I'm going to go ahead and we'll just leave it at this. That's good. Actually, I'll go down to, this is what we did the other day, all the way down, fourth from the bottom, you've got descendant user objects. And then I'm going to go ahead and just turn on change or reset password. All right. Now I'm going to go back to my Netwrix server. Just going to force a quick update. Just heard the email ding in my ear from the alert, but I can also come back to, actually I can go to my alert if I wanted to. And go to my filters and click on preview. And you'll see here, there's the change from today. So that way you can test it to make sure that it worked. Now, whatever you do there, make sure you go and remove it afterwards, so it's not just sitting out there. But that's a good way if you want to test to make sure it's working. The other thing, when you are building that alert, make sure you do admin SD holder, all one word. And then if you really want to test it, you could just leave off the detail so that you could see any changes to admin SD holder as well.
No, that's a great detailed response and some great practical advice there, Michael. Thank you. So I think we're in a Q&A section, and we did mention we have one other poll, so maybe we can pop that one up, Michael. We don't have any additional questions right now, so we'll give folks another minute here if they're interested in asking another question. But we'll pop up this poll. How concerned are you about IT governance for cloud applications? So if you take a moment and populate that, and again, we'll share out the results of this when we share follow-up information. But we really do appreciate you taking some time to answer these for us. Kind of helps us shape some of our thinking as we drive forward. And at this point, I do not see any additional questions coming in. So I think that we can probably give folks back 10 minutes of their day. So I want to thank everyone oh wait, we got another question here. So let's, perfect timing. And it's related to the previous topic. So in my admin SD holder, I have a list of account unknown. Some appear to be linked to our old Exchange server that is decommissioned. Should I be concerned?
Gavin, I'll let you answer that because your title has the word security in it.
Yes. Well, the strategy should be, yeah, if you see, wherever you see dead SIDs, those SIDs can't be resolved to any existing objects, whip them out. Yeah, if they're not resolving to any objects, then they're not really going to be a threat as such, but it's not going to harm you to remove those. Just make sure that you've got kind of the standard stuff is in there. So there's a set of groups and users that you'd expect to sort of appear in there, things like domain admins and so on. So just make sure that you've got things in there that wouldn't take, you wouldn't lose access. But if there's dead SIDs, this should be fun to rip out.
Excellent, thank you, Gavin. And we did get another question come in, and I think it's unusual when I can answer one, but I'm going to take a crack. So we had someone that just joined late. So we did talk about ransomware, and I'm using the royal we. Gavin spoke about ransomware at the beginning. This will be recorded and sent out. There's going to be some additional material, some additional slides that show different ways to detect different threats using Netwrix Auditor. So you'll see all of that, Mark, in the materials that you get as follow-up.
And Mark, if you happen to be referring to the alert that you saw when I was sharing out my screen where it talked about the ransomware alert, that particular item was not covered today, but that alert was actually created in the webinar we did a couple of months ago on alerts, and there will be a slide in the slide deck with a link to all of our past seminars and what they covered. So look for, if that's the one you happen to be looking for, look for the one that mentions alerts when you get the slides tomorrow.
Yeah, great call out. Great call out. All right, well, I'm gonna try again and see. This generated some questions last time, but I don't see any new ones. So I thought we were gonna give people 10 minutes back. It looks like maybe 8 minutes back. So I do want to thank Gavin and Michael for a great job. I want to thank everyone for carving out time. I know for a lot of you it was over lunch, for carving out time to join us today. I hope you found the content valuable and that this was time well spent. You will see all those follow-up materials come out promptly. I also want to thank Julia, whose name does not appear on the slide, but does a great job making all these things work for us. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Cheerio.